Well, thank you so much, Patrick, and thanks also to Leanne for all the help in getting me here. Really delighted to be here. I've only been at Emory University once before, and the campus is just remarkably well appointed. I was looking at it with an administrator's eye at a certain point thinking, boy, they're really managing the endowment well, and look at this fine use of space, and gosh, look how happy, I see the faculty shaking their heads. Yeah, I see the difference. I'm especially delighted to be speaking to this sort of audience. I taught for a year at Notre Dame in their Great Books program as an undergraduate. I worked mightily to cobble together a kind of great books education on my own, getting degrees in both English and philosophy, dabbling in classics for a time, being a Russian studies major for a time, really trying to get a coherence to that education. And I applaud Emory for having this program, and I applaud the students for embracing this program. So I want to talk today about Shakespeare and the end of heroism, and I want to start with one of my favorite quotes by William Blake, a quote that I first used 25 years ago in my dissertation, attempting to become more than man, we become less. And I'd like you to let that quote float for a little while in your head as we move through some of the ideas that I want to talk about today with Shakespeare and the end of heroism. And I've grown very interested in this concept of heroes of late. I find myself asking, do we still have heroes? Who are they? Why are they heroes? And in the 20th century, where I've done the bulk of my research in literature, this has become a particular problem. The 20th century has been termed the mock heroic age. And James Joyce, in his great epic of 1922, Ulysses, sort of set the standard for this idea. Joyce retold the story of Homer's Odyssey, and he makes of Odysseus, certainly one of the archetypes of the hero, he makes of Odysseus a lower class Jewish man living in Catholic Dublin who sells advertising copy and whose wife is cheating on him the day of the book. This is hardly the stuff of heroism, we might think. Joyce seems to make a joke out of heroism. And then I think about heroism in the 21st century, in our information-saturated age. Do we simply know too much about our heroes for heroism to be anything more than a vacant concept? And then I start thinking about Shakespeare, who wrote these great plays about 400 years ago, and I'm wondering what Shakespeare can tell us about heroes and heroism. So let's think for a little bit about what it is that Shakespeare does. You know, Shakespeare is one of the things we can still count on our first-year students having read in high school. I usually say they've read something by Shakespeare and probably The Great Gatsby, which means that we don't despair, right? I mean, there's something there if we have those two. What is it that Shakespeare do? He takes great ideas. And Shakespeare is one of the great intellectuals of Western culture. He takes great ideas and he dramatizes them on the stage. He literally gives them voices and bodies on the stage. And so he dramatizes great ideas. So in As You Like It, he dramatizes the idea of love in the figure of Rosalind. In Hamlet, he dramatizes the quest for meaning in the central character. In Macbeth, he dramatizes pride and ambition. And in particular, he dramatizes the idea of kingship. Shakespeare is obsessed with kingship. You really can't go through a Shakespeare play without finding a king, or at least a king-like figure, a princess, a duke, an earl, some figure who inhabits that place of kingship. He's obsessed with the concept and the purpose of kingship, and in effect, the king is Shakespeare's cultural version of the hero. This is where the rhetoric of heroism resides in Shakespeare's work. Now, in Shakespeare's own age, kingship was an enormously unstable concept. Just leading up to the period he was born, there had been a century of civil war over kingship. During his lifetime, there was enormous anxiety about the succession. His monarch, Queen Elizabeth, did not marry, did not have a child. Her cousin, James VI of Scotland, would take over the throne. His son, Charles I, would be executed by the Puritans just a generation after Shakespeare's death. So there's this enormous anxiety and uncertainty and pressure on the concept of kingship. And it led to the assertion by Shakespeare's own monarch, James I, of the divine right of kings. And I'm sure you're familiar with this idea, that the king derives his power and his prestige and his office from God himself, and only God can take away that power and that office. It's an elegant argument for one to make who is holding power. I often think Vladimir Putin would be very much in favor of the divine right of kings. More seriously, some of the Islamic caliphates would want to cling to this idea of the divine right of kings. And when I think about successions of power that are achieved with peace, I think it's good for us to still sort of marvel at that, though we tend to take it for granted in the American system. To rebel against the king is to rebel against God himself. And this idea is given articulate voice in Shakespeare's great history play, Richard II. Richard is challenged by a rebel army early on in that play, and he exclaims, "Show us the hand of God that hath dismissed us from our stewardship." And Richard's argument is, without that hand of God, you can't take the kingship away from me. That's the only power that the kingship would recognize. Now, Richard II is the first in a series of 4 history plays, the second tetralogy of history plays. Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V. And these are plays that take historical action and history itself as their subject matter. And in these plays, Shakespeare asks the fundamental political question of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Does the ruler derive his power from God's grace or from his own innate human worthiness? And again, Shakespeare gives this question bodies and voices on the stage. He sort of puts it into play, literally and figuratively, in his dramas. And this is a big part of what I want to pursue today, this great political problem. So in that play, when Richard II's cousin, Henry, returns from his exile in France to take back the lands that Richard has confiscated from him, Richard sees what Henry really wants to do, that Henry wants to take the entire crown from him. Henry protests that he has only come to take back his own, but Richard knows he will seize the crown and by extension call into question the very foundation of monarchy itself. But here's the problem. Richard is the divinely anointed king, yes, but he's a very bad king. He runs the crown into terrible debt. He has poor advisors. He surrounds himself with those who inspire no trust or loyalty. He's selfish. He is spoiled. Henry, on the other hand, is immensely capable, makes swift decisions, very decisive, and he crucially understands the difference between appearance and reality, a concept I want to return to in a little bit. He speaks seldom, and when he does, it's to the point, and he hides his ambition beneath a fair exterior. At first, Henry says he swears he doesn't want to take the crown, but Richard says, "Well you deserve, they well deserve that know the strongest and surest way to get." So Richard understands you have the might, and that will make you right. You will use that to take the crown. And indeed, in 2 more scenes, Henry will declare his determination to become king. He says, "In God's name, I'll ascend the regal throne." And that's really interesting. He's going to take the throne from God's anointed king, and he's going to do it in God's own name. There's a kind of assertion and contradiction of the divine right of kings in what Henry is trying to do. So the defining political question of the age is given dramatic form on stage. Is Richard the rightful king because God anointed him? Or is Henry the rightful king because of his greater political skill? And the more pressing question, which one is better for the kingdom itself, Richard or Henry? Now the questions raised in these plays, in Richard II, they run through the rest of the 4 plays, the 2 Henry IVs and Henry V. Each examines different facets of kingship and different challenges of kingship. And Richard II poses the overarching question about kingship. Henry IV, 1 and 2, and Henry V give us actual persons who wear the crown, these compelling figures, Henry IV and his son, Prince Hal, who will become Henry V. Now, the Henry IV plays, parts 1 and 2, show the suffering and decline of the king as a hero. And Richard II, Henry, who will become Henry IV, is energetic, decisive, charismatic, youthful. By Henry IV, Part 1, he is worn with care. He himself is now facing rebellion. He is reaping the very seeds that he has sown, given the model for rebellion. In fact, when Richard II is being let off, he turns to Northumberland, the earl who's been the biggest help to Henry, and he says, "You are the vaulting ladder that Henry has used to overthrow me. Soon you will imitate what you have done. You will become a rebel in your turn." And that is certainly a grim prophecy that comes true. And remember, Shakespeare's audience has that century of civil war in the background as they're watching these plays. They understand how quickly the order of kingship can become the chaos of civil war. By Henry IV, Part 2, Henry IV is dying in failure and regret. And he is also concerned about his son, who is also in rebellion, not against the kingship, but that age-old plot of the son rebelling against the father. And it's one of the masterful ways in which Shakespeare structures this in so many of his plays, to have both a public plot, the plot of civil war and monarchy, and then a private plot, an intimate, a familial plot, the son rebelling against his father, which mirrors in crucial ways the second plot, or the first plot, the public plot. Now, a new figure appears in the Henry IV plays, and this is the figure of Falstaff, the fat knight who rejects honor, duty, nation, has scorn for our concept of heroism, and instead is an advocate for mirth, for revelry, and personal gain. And Falstaff loves the young Prince Hal, the future Henry V. And for a time he becomes almost a father figure to Hal. And the play sets in motion a series of opposing principles. The order of Henry IV versus the disorder of Falstaff, the law of the king versus the outlaw nature of Falstaff. They actually rob people and take their money. Responsibility, to which Prince Hal is being called, as opposed to the pleasure, the life of mirth that Falstaff offers. Duty versus being carefree. And then brilliantly, Shakespeare contrasts these crucial places. The court, which is the place of order and law and kingship and responsibility, to which Hal knows he is called. And then the tavern world, the world of night, of revelry, of play, of acting, and of fun. The world that Hal finds himself drawn to, but where he knows he cannot stay for long. Hal views his future kingship as a burden. He calls it the debt I never promised. So heroism for Hal is a duty, not something to aspire to, but something to grapple with, to struggle with, to want to escape. And I think there's something very contemporary about that. When we think about heroes today in popular culture, athletics, media, etc., and we see them struggle with the burden of heroism, there's a kind of rough parallel, I think, to Prince Hal. But we begin to see that these plays are plays about the education of a king. Hal is learning what it means to be a king, and by extension, what it means to be a hero. Now, one of the great scenes in Henry IV, Part 1, occurs early on in the second act, in the tavern world. And it's a version of Shakespeare's favorite device, the play within the play, which we see in almost every Shakespeare play. Twelfth Night has this, Midsummer Night's Dream has this, most famously Hamlet has this, the mousetrap scene that Hamlet stages himself in the middle of the play Hamlet. The play within the play is always a self-conscious moment of acting. When the main play, let's say Hamlet, comments upon what it means to be in a play, the mousetrap scene itself, and we see Hamlet thinking about what it means to act and to perform, and how we do that in our everyday lives as well as in an actual play on the stage. And this is one of Shakespeare's central insights, that we are all always actors in some way, playing a part or playing many parts. And Falstaff tells Hal in this scene that when he comes before his father the king the next day, he's going to be in big trouble, terribly upbraided for his wastrel ways, for wasting his time in the tavern, not being a responsible prince, etc. Practice and answer, he tells the young prince. Get ready, rehearse for confronting your father. And Hal, who is learning the importance of playing a role, says eagerly, do thou stand for my father and examine me upon the particulars of my life. So they set up this dramatic moment when Falstaff will play the king, the father, and Hal at first will play himself. Now the key in watching a play within the play in Shakespeare is always to try to figure out what is acting and what is real. Another version of his great theme of appearance versus reality. And here the real would be the true expression of that character's thoughts or beliefs or feelings beyond play acting, beyond mere appearance. And Shakespeare is obsessed with this idea of appearance versus reality. In Hamlet, this is what Hamlet describes as seems versus is. There's that great moment in Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet when he's all dressed in black and his mother says, well, why are you so upset about your father's death? People die all the time. Why seems it so particular with thee? And Hamlet, who is the great obsessor of language in all literature, seizes on that word seems. He says, seems, madam, nay, it is. I know not seems. And then he goes through a whole list of the way we seem to be in mourning. Tears and gasping and wearing black and so forth. And he says, these indeed might seem, for they are actions that a man might play. And there's that metaphor of acting. And he says, but I have that within which passeth show. These but the trappings and the suits of woe. And of course, trappings and suits are costumes and props. Right? He's going to that metaphor of the theater. But as we watch the play Hamlet, we realize that Hamlet is increasingly unable to tell the difference between when he is acting and when he is really being himself. He loses himself in the multiple parts, which we might think is also a definition of madness. So you see that great question about whether or not Hamlet is mad or not becomes increasingly complicated when we think about these metaphors of acting and performance. In this moment, Falstaff takes on the role of the king, Hal's real father. Now, Falstaff knows he's never going to become king, but to be Prince Hal's father, in some ways, that is Falstaff's true fantasy, to be the father of this magnificent and also beloved young prince. So we start to see that his deepest desires start to peek through the performing self, right? The real comes out, and we see it through the seeming, through the performance. And Falstaff begins by roundly criticizing the young prince for how thou art accompanied, right? Your companions. It is the classic complaint of parents to their children, right? Well, you're friends. I'm not that wild about them, right? As I'm worried about the rough company you're running with. And of course, he's talking about himself, about Falstaff and the tavern world. And he says that a man's companions are like pitch. They will stick to you for good or ill. And this is pretty close to what the real Henry IV is going to say to his son. But then, of course, Falstaff shifts the ground. He says, and yet there is a virtuous man whom I have often noted in thy company, but I know not his name. And of course, Hal knows where this is going. He says, what manner of man, and it like your majesty? And of course, Falstaff is talking about himself, so he has this opportunity. He's staged it so he can sing his own praises. And this is funny, but it's also his opportunity to pour his spirits into the young prince's ear, to begin to influence, to sway Hal, to think kindly of him when Hal eventually becomes king. And he says, let me move ahead a bit here. I got ahead of myself. He says, a goodly portly man in faith and a corpulent, Falstaff, of course, is enormously fat, of a cheerful look, a pleasing eye, and a most noble carriage, and as I think his age some 50, or by your lady inclining to 80. Falstaff might be 70 or even older in the play. He always makes himself younger, right, than he seems to be. And now I remember me, his name is Falstaff. If that man should be lewdly given, he deceiveth me. For Harry, I see virtue in his looks. If then the tree may be known by the fruit, as the fruit by the tree, then peremptorily I speak it, there is virtue in that Falstaff. Him keep with, the rest banish. Now, all of their friends are around them too. So he's sort of saying, keep me and get rid of the rest of you. So he's a little unaware of audience in certain ways. Well, Hal has had enough of this, and he insists that Falstaff switch places with him. All right, you play me, the prince. Let me play my father, the king. And Falstaff cries out, depose me, which is funny, but it also reminds us of the central political dilemma of these plays, that Hal's going to become king only because his father became king by deposing the rightful king. Remember that unseating of God's anointed keeps recurring through these plays. It's a kind of political version of original sin. So now Hal is playing the part of the king. And this is part of Shakespeare's lesson here, that politics is theater and theater is politics. Hal has been playing a part all along, and the part of king is precisely that, an act or a part. So now he accuses Falstaff, who's now impersonating the prince, that is himself. And this too is embedded in Hal's psychology. When he yells at Falstaff, yelling at himself, he is accusing himself. A self-accusation that he has forsaken his responsibilities, is not behaving the way a prince should. So Hal's own voice begins to emerge. The seeming and the is are contesting in the persona of his father as he accuses himself in the person of Falstaff. Thou art violently carried away from grace. There is a devil haunts thee in the likeness of an old fat man. A ton of man is thy companion. Why dost thou converse with that trunk of humors, that bolting hutch of beastliness, that swollen parcel of dropsies, that huge bombard of sack, that stuffed cloak bag of guts, that roasted Manningtree ox with a pudding in his belly, that reverend vice, that gray iniquity, that father ruffian, that vanity in years. These are basically fat jokes, okay? Elizabethan fat jokes, and then working in some old jokes. This has been funny since Greek theater, but then looks where it starts to go. Wherein is he good, but to taste sack and drink it? Wherein neat and cleanly, but to carve a capon and eat it? Wherein cunning, but in craft? Wherein crafty, but in villainy? Wherein villainous, but in all things? Wherein worthy, but in nothing? And the humor begins to drop out. And Falstaff is sitting there taking all of this, kind of laughing for a while, and then usually the way it's played, he begins to see this is getting very serious. There's a real critique coming out from the performance. Falstaff is too smart not to sense that in some ways Hal is speaking what he really feels about Falstaff, or at least a part of what he feels. So Falstaff begins to outperform the performer. And this is what's true of Falstaff. One thing that Falstaff and Hamlet, who seem so dissimilar, very much have in common. They're the two greatest performers in all of Shakespeare, never at a loss for words, always able to come up with a device, a stratagem. So he says, I don't know who you're talking about. And then Hal says it plainly, that villainous, abominable misleader of youth, Falstaff, that old white-bearded Satan. You know, you can't mistake this, right? It's as obvious as can be. So now we're watching. How will Jack Falstaff get out of this? And he offers a sympathetic view of Falstaff. He says, if sack and sugar be a fault, God help the wicked. If to be old and merry be a sin, then many an old host that I know is damned. If to be fat is to be hated, then Pharaoh's lean kine are to be loved. No, my good Lord. Banish Peto, banish Bardolph, banish Poins, right, all the followers. But for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, and therefore more valiant being as he is old Jack Falstaff. Banish not him thy Harry's company, banish not him thy Harry's company, that powerful repetition that he gives. Banish plump Jack, and banish all the world. Very powerful speech, and there's a powerful truth at work there. There's a sense in which Falstaff is all the world, this endlessly creative impulse, this life of the party, mirth, frivolity, generation, creativity. A world without Falstaff is a diminished world indeed. Hal realizes this. This is why he stays with Falstaff for so long, overlong perhaps. But he also realizes to become a king, to become a hero, he must say goodbye to the world of the tavern and the misrule it represents. And so there's a dramatic pause after banish plump Jack and banish all the world, and Hal responds, I do, I will. These 4 brief beats, I do, I will. I'm doing it now, and I will do it in the future. Now, who is speaking there? Is it Hal in his persona as the king? I do, I will. The king's going to banish Falstaff. Or is it Hal really, right? The is coming out from the seams. I'm going to do that. I'm going to reject you. When I become king, you're toast. You're not going to stay with me. You're not going to be one of my followers. We might think that from this point forward, Falstaff should know that his days are numbered. But he doesn't surrender. That's not in Falstaff's nature. There's a knocking on the door, signaling that that larger world is coming to call. And Falstaff says, play out the play. I have much to say in the behalf of that Falstaff. And indeed, Shakespeare will devote a whole additional play to Falstaff and speaking on his behalf. And then all the way into the sequel until finally Prince Hal will condemn Falstaff to die in poverty and isolation, far from the young king whom he genuinely loves. As we move into Henry IV Part 2, there's a great shift between the 2 parts of the play. We have much less courage and honor as the great figure of Hotspur dies in Part 1, and he's replaced by the cunning, Machiavellian, distasteful Prince John. Henry IV, as I said, is dying, anxious, unable to sleep or rest. Falstaff is less funny in the second play and more pathetic. There's the approach of his death, the great themes of disease, decay, and weariness. And at the very end, Hal accepts the crown and rejects Falstaff, saying to him in front of the whole coronation, I know thee not, old man, fall to thy prayers. And Hal assumes the debt he never promised. He submits to being a hero. And this brings us then to Henry V, long understood as the play of Shakespeare's that is most about heroism, and that offers a kind of unadulterated figure of the hero in Henry V. And this is a play that is all about acting, at least as much as Hamlet. Indeed, Henry V is a kind of crucial precursor to Hamlet. I don't think Shakespeare could have written Hamlet had he not written Henry V just a few years before. Henry is a master of performance. Remember, his whole strategy in parts 1 and 2 is to seem to be he's going to be the worst king England has ever seen. And his strategy is, if I set expectations really low, no matter what kind of king I am, people are going to be pleased with me. Right? He's better off than we had thought. So there's a kind of cunning, manipulative side to Hal all the way through those plays. In Henry V, there's a great scene for this. Henry as a master of performer, and it's the treason scene. In this scene, let me skip ahead here a little bit. In this scene, the English army is preparing to embark to France, this great invasion of France. And 3 of Henry's most trusted lords have turned traitor, and they're going to assassinate the king. The king knows this, the other lords know this, but oddly the king is delaying his apprehension of the traitors. And the other followers are wondering, why is he doing this? Why doesn't he just, chop off their heads and be done with it? So instead, Henry gathers his whole court around him. And the traitors come in with the other knights, and he gathers them around, and he listens as the traitors tell him how loyal all of his followers are. Then Henry says that he's going to set free a man who the day before had been criticizing the king. And the 3 traitors object. One says, that's mercy, but too much security. Another says, let him be punished, sovereign, lest example breed by his sufferance more of such a kind. Oh, let us yet be merciful, says King Henry. So may your highness, and yet punish too, says another. And Henry says, if I'm not going to be merciful to this guy he's just criticized me, how shall we stretch our eye when capital crimes, chewed, swallowed, and digested, appear before us. And of course, we know that precisely such crimes are there in the three traitors who would assassinate the king. Then he asks them to step forward and receive their commissions. These are their orders, giving them the honor of the things the king has asked him to do. They open the letters eagerly, and there they read the revelation that everybody knows that they are traitors, and they know that they're doomed. And they fall on their knees and ask the king for mercy, and he responds, "The mercy that was quick in us but late, by your own counsel is suppressed and killed. You must not dare for shame to talk of mercy, for your own reasons turn into your bosoms as dogs upon their masters." So in effect, Henry has staged their whole self-accusation. They spoke the very lines that counseled against mercy, as if Henry had written the script and directed the actors in their performance. And he demonstrates to his other followers, this awareness of audience, to his other followers how all-knowing and in control he is. This is why he wants everybody else to see what he is doing. He shows his thorough understanding of how politics is theater. So this is a king who fully grasps what we now would call spin, PR, propaganda, how to play the political situation. And this becomes the great question of Henry V. Is this all Henry is, a cynical manipulator? Or is there something true to him? Is he the pragmatic leader who understands the costs of kingship, or is he a figure of heroic integrity? And for Shakespeare, the answer is yes, it is both. And this is always true of Shakespeare. If there's one thing that I would want you to remember about Shakespeare, it's that he is the great spokesman for ambivalence and multiplicity in Western culture, the great spokesman for self-conflict. Henry is both. We are always divided and multiple. As Jaques states in As You Like It, each man in his time plays many parts. And we might think that inhabiting that condition is Shakespeare's true meaning of heroism. Now, all this culminates in the great St. Crispin's Day speech, which, in case you haven't committed it to memory, I've put it up here for us to think about. So, at the end of Henry V, his weary army is about to fight the French. They're outnumbered like 20,000 to 5. I mean, the odds are just extraordinary. They're exhausted, they're bedraggled, they're weary. And some of the soldiers are saying, geez, if only some of those people in England doing nothing were here with us. And then Henry comes on the scene. And he has this opportunity to find some way to inspire his troops. And so he makes this great dramatic speech. And it sort of comes out of nowhere. He says, "This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when the day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian." So notice how he's playing with time and memory in this speech, right? He's really predicting a future that is so uncertain for them. And then he imagines what they will do years hence if they survive. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, "These wounds I had on Crispin's day." And he goes back to memory. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day, meaning this day, the battle that's about to happen. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups, freshly remembered. There's a kind of immortality in memory that he's using to inspire his troops. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day until the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. And then he acknowledges that the odds were against them. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, And now he turns all of his pathetic soldiers into noblemen. For he who sheds his blood with me today shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, common born, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speak who fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. And whenever the speech is delivered properly, all right, in the theater, it's rousing. I mean, it's one of those speeches, one of the few in Shakespeare where the audience should applaud if it's well done, even though it kind of breaks up the fourth wall between the actors and the audience. Is it masterful manipulation? Does it inspire these men to throw their bodies on the French spears despite all odds? Well, yeah, it is that. The Machiavellian reading can work. Is it an example of the model of the Christian king, as he's called in the epilogue to the play, who puts nation and the greater good ahead of himself? Well, yes, it's that too. We get both in effect in this play. So this explains the odd image that I have there at the bottom. There's a famous theory about the rabbit-duck reading of Henry V. Is it a rabbit? Is it a duck? And there's actually a famous essay about that about this play. Henry is both. It depends on your perspective. And in a way, we have to hold both readings of him in mind. He is both Machiavellian manipulator and noble, heroic, self-sacrificing king or hero. Whenever anybody tells me this is what a Shakespeare play means, or this is what a Shakespeare character is, I always get distrustful, all right? Including when I start to say it. They always elude our interpretation. Hamlet's words to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are very instructive in this regard. He says, and this is almost like Hamlet speaking to the readers, to us. He says, you would play upon me. You would seem to know my stops. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery. This is that seems versus is. What is most is authentic. You would pluck that out. You would sound me from my lowest note to the top of my compass. Call me what instrument you will. And here he's speaking to us. Though you can fret me, yet you cannot play upon me. So there's this resistance to interpretation by the great Shakespearean figures. All right, I'm going to move a little more quickly. I had this whole riff I was going to do on Antony and Cleopatra and talk about Mark Antony as another example of the hero. Shakespeare's heroes then always multiple, always ambivalent, always one thing and another. So Shakespeare resists the either or. It's always the both and for Shakespeare. And Mark Antony is a really good example of the hero because, of course, we get him in Julius Caesar in about 1599, probably the same year Shakespeare wrote Henry V. But then we get him, almost a decade later in Antony and Cleopatra. So we get a sort of pre and post in a way. We get a kind of comparison of the same hero. In Julius Caesar, Antony starts off as a minor figure, gives his great speech at Caesar's corpse, conquers Brutus and becomes one of the triumvirate and one of the masters of the world. So we see the kind of arc of character in this play. Antony starts low and he ends up very high. Caesar starts high and then he goes low. Brutus is sort of in the middle, goes high, and then we see him plummet. So very important in a Shakespeare play to watch for that arc of character. This, of course, defines most tragic structures. And this is how we understand the hero as well in Western culture. What they call the monomyth of the hero, always following this pattern, whether it's Jason or Odysseus or Jesus Christ. The call, the test, the victory, your arc is at the top, and then the inevitable fall. When we then turn to Antony and Cleopatra, so if we look at Antony and Julius Caesar, he's at the bottom, he gets the test, he is victorious. Well, what's going to happen next? He's going to fall. We don't get that in Julius Caesar. But then if we turn to Antony and Cleopatra, in effect, that whole play is a long story of Antony's decline. It finishes that trajectory of the hero that he had begun 8 years before. And the fact that it takes a whole play for that maybe gives us an indication of Antony's greatness. Antony, I would argue, finally rejects heroism. When we compare him to Henry V, Henry V determines that it's worth it to take on the burden of king. He decides it is worth it to embrace the world and become that hero figure. Antony, in effect, rejects that argument. He finally refuses the burden of kingship. And why does he do that? He looks at what mastery of the world would give him. And for a time, he does indeed straddle the world like a colossus. And then he seems to give that up. He looks at what the world could offer him, and he finds the world wanting. The play Antony and Cleopatra is all about searching for a greater meaning than the merely material world. That's the domain of Caesar. He becomes the great bureaucrat of the world. Antony turns his back on that. The poetry that expresses the love between the two, Antony and Cleopatra, is overwhelming. As Yeats would say, it burns the whole combustible room, but it can't be sustained. And in some ways, that astonishing poetry is despairing when we look at how the world cannot offer anything equivalent to their desire. Antony and Cleopatra are finally failed questers. And failed because there's nothing in the world equal to their desire. And in this, they most resemble Shakespeare's final four plays, the late romances, the last four plays that Shakespeare wrote. Antony and Cleopatra is really his last great tragedy. It's sort of his farewell to tragedy as he turns his back on the tragic worldview. In the late romances, we get a world that is neither comic nor tragic, does not show the hero's rise, nor does it really show the hero's fall. The romances instead show endurance. They show suffering, and they show the overwhelming need of humanity for grace, for a forgiveness that cannot be earned. And the pattern of romance, different, you'll note, from the pattern of heroism. There's a great wrongdoing, there is suffering and penance, and finally there is forgiveness and reconciliation, but the sin or the suffering is not forgotten. It lingers. It's still there. It persists. There's a sadness to the world of romance. Heroism is now merely human survival and trying to get some sense of connection to the larger patterns of the creation, the life cycle, the relation of parents to children, the very things that don't happen in Antony and Cleopatra. And in this, to return to where our journey began, Shakespeare is most like James Joyce in his great epic Ulysses, in the redefining of heroism. Joyce turned to Odysseus as the hero most appropriate to the modern age, to the world of the early 1900s, the world that had seen the horrors of World War I and had seen what humanity could do to itself. He said the hero appropriate to our age is the anti-hero. And he tells the story of Leopold and Molly Bloom and their all too human love. Leopold, as I said, becomes the figure of Odysseus, and he is a mock hero. Why the figure of Odysseus? Why did Joyce seize upon that? He is the anti-hero. Remember when the Greeks come to take Odysseus to war, he doesn't want to go. He pretends to be mad. And they put his son Telemachus in front of the plow, and if he were to go over him, he would indeed be mad. He stops. And they say, you love your son, you're not mad, you're going to go to war with us. So Joyce seized upon that affection of the father for the son. And Odysseus as almost a kind of pacifist. And of course, the quest of the Odyssey is not the quest of the Iliad to conquer. It's the quest to do what? To go home, to return to family, and to return to love. Leopold is a sort of mock Odysseus, as I said. As he goes through his day's journey, his wife, Molly, his faithful Penelope, is having a passionate love affair and betraying him. But when he comes home that night, or early the next morning, and they lay in bed together, Leopold and Molly return in memory to their early courtship and love. And that love is rekindled, and there's a kind of reaffirmation. And in Molly's closing words, we get a sort of affirmation and benediction of the possibilities of 20th century love. She writes or speaks, "And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I, yes, to say, yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. So to bring all this to a close, the traditional concept of heroism, which for Shakespeare took the form of kingship, belongs most properly to the realm of tragedy. In tragedy, the life course of the single man or woman has the paramount importance. This is why tragedies are named for people, King Lear, Othello, etc. But tragedy is always the smaller perspective. The comic perspective is more cosmic. It sees human action in the more universal frame, both its pettiness and insignificance. Think about how often kings rise and fall in the history plays. It becomes almost silly. But also in its true grandeur, the continuity of life, the awesome power of love, the harmony of our human being with the cycles and powers of nature, and our overwhelming need for grace, and every once in a while, the bestowing of that grace. These are the elements lacking in tragedy and in the great tragic heroes like Antony. For finally, Shakespeare tells us that heroism, traditionally understood, is an empty concept, a false idol. I see Shakespeare as one of the first great Western intellectuals to call into question our concepts of heroism. Less than a century later, Milton will try to restore the concept of the hero by offering us his godly epic Paradise Lost, with Jesus Christ at its center. Yet, as generations of readers have noted, most readers of Milton's epic find his depiction of Lucifer far more compelling than his depiction of Jesus, prompting Blake to say that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. There's something about the idea of the great hero that makes us less than human, either monstrous like Macbeth or pathetic like Antony. In Blake's words, attempting to become more than man, we become less. Shakespeare suggests, as does Joyce, as do the Gospels and certain other works of what I would call wisdom literature, that heroism consists in finding and celebrating our humanity and that which makes us most human. As Wordsworth memorializes this, that best portion of a man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Thank you very much.